Just ahead on the program, as the conclave begins in Rome, we'll speak with an African cardinal who tells us what he's looking for in a new pope, and it could take a very long time to choose one. And 6-month-old baby and her father are gunned down in the family car. It's another violent attack on Chicago streets. And New York City soda lovers, you can rejoice. Your Big Gulp is safe. 16-ounce drinks are safe for now. But the mayor says not so fast.
Broadcasting live from the heart of New York City to the U.S. and across the globe, this is Arise America.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Arise America. I want to introduce you to our lineup today. Every day, we'll have a guest host from all walks of life, including analyst and happens to be comedian, and that's who we have today. Her name is Negin Farsad. She is a comedian and a filmmaker, and will chime in on the biggest stories of the day. We're going to speak more to Negin shortly in the show, so sit tight where you are. Don't worry, we're coming back to you. But also, my partner in news, Christina Brown, is here. And Christina, why don't you tell us right now what we have planned for today's show?
Well, we certainly have a lot going on. Good morning to you, Debbie. Good morning, Negin. Thank you for joining us today. Well, next week marks the 10th anniversary of the launch of the Iraqi war. Foreign Affairs and war correspondent Brian Palmer will be here to talk about that, as well as news from Afghanistan and North Korea. Also, what is the future of the U.S. Voting Rights Act? The Supreme Court may gut parts of this historic legislation, and we will have a couple of legal experts to shed light on how that could set back decades of civil rights progress. And of course, the team from our new show, Entertainment 360, joins us to preview the latest in fashion and celebrity gossip. Debbie, can't wait for that.
Sounds like good stuff. We also have a business team, and they're going to bring us the latest on what's happening in the markets, as well as in the world of finance. And Chitra Nabat is standing by to give us information and insight on that. How's money looking today, Chitra?
Money is always looking good, Debbie. At least so we hope and think. And since we know you love business, we hope in our dreams, we're going to bring you a U.S. market update and what's happening in corporate America. The Facebook COO Sheryl Sandberg, she's under fire, so we're going to talk to you about that. And then we're going to break away and talk about what's happening in the rest of the world with global market developments. There's a view that China is colonizing Africa, so we want to bring you information there. And following on China, I'll actually be interviewing later in the program a top cross-border expert who can help American entrepreneurs figure out how to navigate the Chinese market.
All right, all sounds good. We'll look forward to seeing that just a little bit later in the show. Thank you, Chitra. Appreciate it. Now, to our guest host. She was named one of the funniest women by the 50 funniest women by the Huffington Post. She's a comedian, filmmaker, and current TED Fellow, Negin Farsad. Her comedic routines feature her frank and sharp-witted views on politics and her unique experiences as a woman of Iranian-American descent. She is currently working on a documentary film called The Muslims Are Coming, and we definitely want to hear more about that. It follows a group of comedians touring the South and Midwest, focusing on Islamophobia through the lens of comedy. You can stay up to the minute with Negin by following her blog, Negin Farsad Online. I want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I also really love that introduction. It's something my mother needs to hear, I think.
Did you tell your mother to watch?
Absolutely.
We'll give you a tape if she
it's what keeps her going is stuff like this. So.
All right, well, you heard Christina tell us what's coming up on this show, so I hope you have your thoughts ready. We're going to come back to you in just a moment, and we're going to just dive into it. But we want to first go to our top story of the day. Of course, today is the day that the 115 cardinals go into conclave. They had a mass earlier today, had lunch, and then went into the conclave. So now we have a report live from Rome with an update on the selection of the new pope. Cardinal Napier, do you expect this conclave to be different from the one you participated in 8 years ago that elected Pope Benedict?
The first major difference is that there are about 50 cardinals who participated in that first one, whereas at the first one there were only 2 who had been in a conclave before. And I think that new experience certainly showed in the way things went. We thought we were taking too long, and in fact it was one of the shortest conclaves going. I think that lack of experience obviously came into the picture in that instance. The second thing I think is, this second difference is, this time there's a far wider range, I think, of candidates, younger cardinals who have, I think, distinguished themselves in their leadership in their churches and in their bishops' conferences and so forth. And so I think the wider range of options that's going to be exercised as well.
I want to ask you about that, but before I do, can you just give me an idea of what these conclaves are like? I know that they are secret for a reason, but sort of lay the ground for what the atmosphere is like when you go in.
I think the atmosphere, certainly for the first time, it was a new experience for all of us. I think we were overwhelmed by the amount of security that met us when we checked in the residence of Santa Marta. The locks on each of the doors had to be sealed. We had to unseal them ourselves. So there was very, very clear communication to us that security and secrecy is something that's paramount in a conclave. The second thing was to be able to do properly whatever was expected of us, like when we actually did our voting. I think we know what it's like now, so it's going to be a little bit easier, not quite as daunting as the first time.
Let me quickly ask you, I know you've had some time to think about this because Pope Benedict announced his resignation a few weeks ago. What are you looking for in the next Pope?
Well, I'm looking for somebody who is going to be able to build on the foundations that were laid by Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict, specifically in the area of a new evangelization, a new way of getting the gospel into people's lives so that they know the gospel not as a book, but as the story of a living person, Jesus, who can make such a difference in their lives. So I think what we need first and foremost is a pope who's going to take up the running of that kind of new evangelization, that program. And hopefully, for me, I think if I reflect on how effective Pope John Paul II's pastoral visits to the different churches around the world, how effective that was, I think the new pope would need to do something similar. There's no telling the impact of a papal visit to a particular church.
Sure.
And so that would be my expectation, my hope.
In a one-word answer, if you can, I'm sorry to interrupt you before we run out of time. In a one-word answer, do you have some favorites in your mind or a favorite going in?
I have a number of people in my mind, yes, I have. And I'm expecting that the first vote is going to be quite scattered, and that thereafter the picture will emerge as to who are, of those that we've identified, who are going to be the really front runners.
Oh, fantastic. Well, Archbishop of Durban in South Africa, Wilfred Cardinal Napier, I thank you so much for taking a few minutes of your time before you go into this conclave. Do you expect it to be a long conclave or a short one? Just one word.
I think it will be longer than the last one.
Well, we will be certainly watching from outside looking for the smoke. Cardinal Napier, thank you so much. Wish you all the best.
You're welcome, David. Thank you.
And that was, again, the Archbishop of Durban of South Africa, Cardinal Wilfred Napier, who spoke with us yesterday just before he went into the conclave, said some very interesting things about that. And so we'll see if it's going to be a short one or a long one. Also, we want to apologize. We had prepared a report live from Rome, and that wasn't it. We'll try to get back to that a little bit later on. But now we want to move on to what we call our water cooler stories of the day, what we've seen in the newspaper and what we think is interesting and what we think that you're talking about. And so we're going to bring in Christina Brown and, of course, our guest co-host today, Negin Farsad. So, Christina, what do we have?
Well, I'm wondering if perhaps we might be able to get a shot of this cover on the New York Post, Judge cans nanny's ban on sweet big sodas. Yeah, so that means I get to drink all the soda I want to drink. So, basically, Mayor Bloomberg had a plan to fight obesity, and that plan included taking soda essentially off the shelves.
You know, and I got to think that other than Bloomberg and people in his administration, I don't know that many people are sad about this development.
You know what? I love that Mayor Bloomberg takes on these healthcare issues. I mean, he's the one who banned cigarette smoking from bars and restaurants in New York City. If you'll recall, back in the day, you would go to a bar or restaurant, you would come out smelling like a chimney, and that was just how we all lived.
Yep.
And now we live in this like delicious smelling world where we only have to smell the urine on the streets of New York and not the smell of cigarettes. But and so this kind of thing, I mean, I actually was a huge fan of this because I think psychologically, like when you're looking at a huge packet of Oreos, you think to yourself, I could keep eating these Oreos, but if you have just if you're just given a small package of Oreos, you're not going to go back and buy a second pack. The psychological impact of going back and getting a second one makes you feel like a bad person. And I feel like that's the psychology that Bloomberg was dealing with here in banning large drinks.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, but that should be a self-regulatory thing.
Exactly.
I don't know that that's something that any government, local, state, or federal government should regulate. And what about folk like me who have children? You can buy one. You're not going to drink the whole thing yourself, but you share it with your whole family. And to not be able to do that, to not be able to make the choice. And what about you two little skinny minis? You don't need anybody regulating your soda intake.
But to your point, part of the ruling for this, essentially what the judge said was that the limits were arbitrary and capricious. And essentially, they were echoing the complaints of city business owners and consumers who basically deemed the rules unworkable and unenforceable. Okay, this is from today's New York Times. And quite frankly, I agree. I'm not sure that those kinds of decisions should be put on store owners. I mean, that's our decision to make, right? Whether or not we want to have that sixth Oreo or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think I like the theoretical position. I like the concept of limiting sugary drinks. You know, for some people can't actually make the best choices for themselves. You know what I mean? So, like, I don't know. In those instances, I like the idea, but I think what you're right about, and you know, the New York Times pointed out, it is a really complicated set of exceptions, and like the size and what kind of store. If the store is bigger than this, then you can sell it. You can't sell it. So that stuff I think was very confusing and complicated, and so I think the judge has a point there.
And unfortunately, the timing of it all, because this ruling came one day before the law was supposed to be enacted.
Yeah.
So restaurants had already begun to buy smaller glasses and smaller containers to be able to comply with this.
And we already had posters and subways, and I mean,
and now we get to go
spend
back
money
to
on
our
this
super
already.
size.
Yes, long live the big goal.
Exactly.
Indigestion forever,
But
guys.
to the
There you
larger
go.
question, though, the reason behind it was because of the issues surrounding obesity and the fact that, as Mayor Bloomberg said, he said obesity kills. There's no question that it kills. So clearly something has to be done because in some cases parents may not be, or individuals may not be making the best decisions, and they are consuming those things that ultimately lead to terrible health conditions and in some cases death.
Yeah, and to that point, I agree with you. The intention was pure, and obesity is a huge problem, and it's not just a health problem, it's an economic problem because the cost of health care to treat the diseases that are a result or worsened by obesity is astronomical. So I go with you there. But as a woman here, I'm gonna open, you know, the closet in my house. As a woman who has fought my weight my whole life and struggle to stay a certain weight, a law is not what is going to help me make a better choice. It's not a law, because if I was able to make make the better choice, I would have already done that. And the law is not going to change that. So approaching personal choices is something that I think has to be done differently than an external law, because the battle that rages within a lot of people like me that deal with weight issues is an internal issue, not an external issue.
And it has nothing to do with what's on the books.
And it's got nothing to do with the size of the soda, because you know what?
It has everything to do with the size of the dress, though.
And the amount of spandex in the fabric.
Spanx, please. Well, you know what? Let's listen to Mayor Bloomberg responding to this ruling.
Saying it's not over.
We were very confident this morning. We think the judge is totally in error in the way he interpreted the law, and we're very confident that we will win on appeal. 70,000 people will die of obesity in America this year. 5,000 people in New York City will die of obesity. Now, the best science tells us that sugary drinks are a leading cause of obesity. Some people say, just talk about the problem, raise awareness, and hope that results in change. But it's not enough to talk, and it's not enough to hope.
Uh-oh, it stopped right there. He said, not enough talk, not enough hope, but you got to put action behind it.
You clearly get his point.
I think is what he was trying to say. All right, move on from the size of our sodas, and let's talk about something of paramount importance, and that is the invasion and the domination of rats in New York City and every other metropolis in the country.
Yeah, but the New York rats are especially unique. I mean, they're the size of cats in some cases.
Oh, please. A cat would hope to be that big.
You know, the Strap Hangers did a survey and found that 1 out of every 10 New Yorkers sees a rat in the New York City subway system. I actually think that there's a huge margin of error there by maybe 90% based on a sample set of me. Right. I see a rat nearly every time I take the subway. So they're a part of New York life.
Absolutely.
And I've come to think that they're almost adorable.
I've
grown accustomed to seeing them so much. I feel like they're family. I don't know.
So you would take one in and adopt a pet rat?
No, I would probably scream incessantly. But no, it's just like you don't even react to them anymore. You just
that
see
is
them
true.
all, yeah.
That is true. I mean,
Yeah.
I remember when I first moved back to New York, to Manhattan in 2007, and when I first saw a rat on the subway platform, I nearly, jumped out of my shoes. And I don't know what was more remarkable, the fact that, I seemed to be the only one that recognized and cared that that this rat was there. I mean, everyone seemed to be looking at me because I was the crazy one for even daring to react, or the fact of just how large they are.
Right.
But the news story, though, as we continue to talk about what we feel about rats, is that scientists have come up with a way that's been tested in other countries, I believe in Thailand and Laos as well, to give the rats a certain type of compound in a bait that essentially would sterilize female rats. It would accelerate the aging of their eggs so they would not produce. So then eventually they would just...
So they want to implement that in, the Metropolitan Transit Authority wants to implement that in New York City so we can kind of calm down our rat situation. And when I first read this story, I thought, are they going to get a bunch of rats and put them in little stirrups? And how is this sterilization process,
going to
happen?
It's actually, they're going to ingest it orally.
They're orally, right. And apparently...
And no danger to humans.
No danger to humans, except that they're sugary and fatty, like little things. So they're apparently delicious for rats and for humans, but nothing will happen if you eat it.
But you know what, and I say this for those who don't know and most don't know, I have a degree in veterinary medicine, so I know a little bit about animals. And this is certainly worth a try. It seems to have been successful. But first of all, rats are smart. And I think it would only take a matter of time for, Shaniqua rat to notice that Pauline rat wouldn't have any more rat babies and make the connection and stop eating the bait.
Right.
I think that they would adapt.
They're that intelligent.
I think that they would adapt. Yeah, I mean, we are genetically engineered to survive. And either, the chemistry of their body would change so that it no longer had effect on their ovaries, or they would figure out that, that little piece of candy is not good.
And your scenario scares me because it suggests that eventually the rats become self-aware and they take over the city.
That sounds like a movie.
Which I think
it's not so much that, but, animals in the wild know which berries to eat and which not to eat. They know which plants are harmful and which are not. And I think the same biology that drives that would eventually prevent the rats from eating the poisonous
Well,
bait.
I mean, if you stuff it in like a half-eaten gyro, you know what I mean, in a garbage can, you know what I mean?
I don't know if
you
they'll
can
go
slip it in.
to those lengths, but the good news is that it appears as though the company that has been contracted to implement this, they've conducted research in other countries, including Laos, India, and the Philippines, with much success. So hopefully that success over there will translate over here
we will see.
in New York. In other news, story out of Detroit, which actually, I'm not sure if there are too many of us who would be surprised, but former Mayor Kwame Kilpatrick was found guilty Monday of a number of charges, including racketeering. And you may remember that he very unceremoniously resigned from the mayor's office due to salacious text messages and inappropriate relationship with an individual in his office. But this, however, is different. This, however, means this is a federal crime, and there are now sentencing is what we.
And he's
wait
already
for.
served jail time.
And he's already served jail
Yeah,
time.
he's been in a world of trouble for quite some time.
And it's not like
it's
that city could use any more bad news.
Right. And in fact, there was a story today about how they've horribly, there's been an audit of Detroit and they've horribly mismanaged funds, which we've known, but the extent to which they've done that is even bigger than we had imagined. But what's really interesting about this Kwame Kilpatrick story is that the fall from grace is so huge because this is a political family. They've been on the scene for decades, and he was a huge rising star in the Democratic Party.
Right.
So this is a big blow. I mean, not just this is a big blow for Democrats. I think all over Michigan, just given how important his family was.
You know, and it begs the question. I think in so many of the cases, shouldn't he have known better? You know, because he was not new to politics.
Mm-hmm.
He was young when he was mayor, and so maybe there was a level of naivete, probably ego. But some of the things that he was charged with and convicted of, you would think, gosh, didn't you know better? Did you really think? And this, of course, is a corruption charge. But you know, back when he was tried for the inappropriate behavior with the staffer, and he was like, did you really think you were going to get away with that? Did you really think they weren't going to find all those text messages? I mean, that just seems.
And at that level, but I think at that level, there's probably a certain amount of arrogance. And one of the things that came out of this particular trial is that he was really portrayed as just a greedy politician. So I think at that level, there's a whole different mindset that we here would think would be obvious. Like, it's obvious that what you're doing is inappropriate, is wrong, is illegal, but he's operating clearly on a different level, different stage.
And some of his gains are so petty, like he got jewelry and free plane rides. I mean, is it really worth it for jewelry and free plane rides? It makes you really, really question how it is that this kind of person became mayor in the first place.
All right, well, let's talk about a polar opposite personality of Kwame Kilpatrick. Let's talk about Negin.
Me? Okay.
Yes. Now, you are a comedian, accomplished filmmaker, but a lot of your comedy comes from your personal experience growing up of Iranian descent in America. Does your comedy come from a place of pain and bias that you felt, or where do you get the humor from?
So, well, what I'm hearing from you is that not every comedian is an Iranian American Muslim female. Is that what you're trying?
I haven't done the research, but I suspect that's the case.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because earlier in my career, I used to be like, no, I have to write about farts and video games like all boys do, and this is a very heavily male-dominated field comedy, and so I tried very much to just blend in and just ignore the ethnic thing and the Muslim part of it. But then later on, I was like, well, actually, especially after, the rise in Islamophobia, my personal story became more and more kind of germane to what's going on in the United States. And also, I think, the other interesting thing about it is, I talk about my parents. I talk about my mom. She talks in a ridiculous, funny accent. And then that kind of stuff ends up sounding political, even though if it's just about my mom, because I'm talking about an Iranian woman who's probably enriching uranium in her backyard or whatever it is she does with her spare time because she's Iranian. So it became important for me to continue telling those stories and to kind of humanize my family as an example of a human story about Iranians that we don't actually ever really get to hear in the United States.
And I wonder, I heard you in your routine talk about Iranabes. Was that the word that you used?
I don't, maybe.
You don't remember that?
No.
Was that too old? Too old of that? Did I go too far back? But you also talk about Islamophobia.
Yeah.
Which I think probably has escalated since 9/11. Has that been your experience?
Yeah, you know what's interesting for me is that, you know, after 9/11, I wasn't, you know, doing as much comedy, but there was a spike in Islamophobia, obviously, and there was like some violent instances around it. But then it seemed to sort of like we kind of died down a little bit. But what's interesting is the election of Barack Obama, I think, led to a spike in Islamophobia because suddenly people were like, well, he might be Muslim, and then you know, and the Republicans used it as a wedge issue to try and get people to react to a man named Barack Hussein Obama. You know,
absolutely, yeah. They made a point to emphasize his middle name.
Exactly, and then
what
Park
does that
51
mean?
happened around the same time, and all that stuff sort of led to this renewed spike in Islamophobia since 2007.
Which means more bookings for you.
There you go. There you go.
I know. I wish it resulted in more airtime for Iranian American Muslim female comedians.
Well,
Well, you're making a good start. You're making a good start. Well, sit right there. We've got some more stuff to talk about and come to, but we want to go away for just a moment. But coming up, next week is the 10th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq. Has the U.S. met its goals, and what has the conflict done for perceptions about America worldwide? We're going to discuss that, North Korea and Afghanistan, with Brian Palmer. But first, let's take a look at one of Nagin's moments in the spotlight. We'll be right back.
I have gone to Iran, and last time I went for my cousin's wedding, and even though we were the same age, I was really, you know, I was concerned about hanging out with her, and I was worried that, you know, did I have to censor myself? Did I have to hide from her all the freedoms I enjoy, like boys and alcohol and peaceable assembly, you know? And I felt like, you know, she knew the truth about me. She would consider me some kind of Iranian American slut whore, hooker, prostitute, which in New York we just call a Facebook friend.
Let me tell you who to blame. Blame the boy lying at your feet, his body oozing life through the hole in his stomach where the bullet tore him apart. Blame him for challenging you, for not looking away and for not backing down when you pulled out the gun. Blame your mother for bringing you into this world when she was but a kid herself and for dragging you up, not bringing you up. Blame society for not giving you hope. Blame your father for not being there, the man who looked after himself instead of looking after you. Blame the gun in your hand for making you a target, for making you more likely to be picked on. Blame the dead boy, blame your mother, blame society, blame your father, blame the gun, blame anyone but yourself for not being strong enough to put down the gun, to break the cycle.
North Korea has declared that the armistice that marked the end of the Korean War that ended in 1953 as invalid, and the country's supreme leader, Kim Jong-un, has ordered his troops to be on, quote, maximum alert. Whether or not he is just ranting remains to be seen. This is one of the foreign affairs stories that we are going to discuss with journalist Brian Palmer, who has seen war up close. He was embedded with the U.S. Marine troops in Iraq 3 times, and next week is the 10th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and so, of course, we want to talk about that as well. Brian Palmer, thank you so much for being with us. We appreciate it. So let's just start with that North North Korea declared that the armistice is no longer in effect, and that the troops are to be on alert. Is this bluster because they are known for that, or should we really be concerned?
Well, North Korean troops always go on alert during the Foal Eagle exercises. It's an enormous U.S. South Korean combined U.S. military exercise. We're talking Air Force, Navy. It also includes the Navy SEALs. And you may recall Navy SEALs, Osama bin Laden killing him in a very kind of secretive operation. So I'm not at all saying that that's what's going to happen in North Korea. There's absolutely no chance of that. But there is some motivation, I think, on the North Korea side to have to kind of respond to this threat. In terms of declaring the armistice null and void, it takes more than one side to do that unless you actually launch hostilities. The North Koreans may be paranoid, they may be isolated, but in my humble opinion, we're not on the verge of war. I mean, look at Kim Il-sung, granddad, look at Kim Jong-il. They've taken us to what looks like the precipice of war or conflict, and they didn't necessarily leap over it. So I think Kim Jong-un is rattling sabers to a degree that may be also directed at his people inwardly, because they're fighting madly to keep this 19th, the 20th century regime, authoritarian regime in power amidst all the pressures that are coming from the outside world.
Even if it seems as though, clearly the threat should be taken seriously, but even though this is something that we have certainly seen before, what then do you think should be the U.S. response? How worried should the U.S. be about this latest threat?
Well, I think the U.S. is responding now, and I think we have to remember the proximate cause of all of this stuff. I mean, North Koreans conducted a third unsanctioned nuclear test, so that's a little bit scary. The UN Security Council unanimously condemned that move, calling it disturbingly destabilizing. UN security has China. China is North Korea's only international buddy. So I think everybody is going to be working behind the scenes and on any scenes that they can to monitor what Kim Jong-un is doing, and also to say, dude, there will be consequences. Because
yeah, and to that point, even the fact that China, their only ally, said, listen, and this is Debbieizing it, you need to calm down. As we would say in the hood, back up now, back up. And they've ignored that. Does that make Kim Jong-un more erratic than his father and grandfather? Is he escalating this, or is he just continuing in the tradition?
Oh my goodness. I would say that that's very difficult to know, because the North Korean leadership is a black box to a large degree, and that insularity, I think, has been fostered, has been grown by the leadership since 1953 in order to maintain this kind of war footing against the outside world. And I think, if I may, you can get a sense of the kind of insularity and also the cult of personality that the leadership tries to inculcate in its people from a book such as Great Leader Kim Jong-il, which is produced by a North Korean-friendly publishing house in Japan. And this is a quote. "It is sublime human love."
You want to see it?
Oh, sure. This is my, this is a book I got in China when I was based in Beijing a number of years ago. Okay. "It is sublime human love that lies at the root of Kim Jong-il's informality and consanguinity with the popular masses. He approaches everything from the human viewpoint and values human beings more than anything else. People are captivated by his fervent human love, with which he assumes responsibility for the destiny of people and strives to bring true human life into blossom." So,
written by Kim Jong-il.
Yeah, written by Kim Jong-il.
The real question, though, on everybody's mind is, what role does Dennis Rodman play in international diplomacy at this stage?
Maybe the North Koreans recruiting him for their own Harlem Globetrotters team. Weird.
Seriously, when you heard those comments, because it made big news the next day that Kim Jong-un had a friend for life in him, and he went on to extol the virtues of his family.
They're besties.
What was your reaction?
What? But upon reflection, It almost kind of sort of makes sense because you have this, well, you've got this freakish cartoon of American sportshood, Dennis Rodman. We heard all about Kim Jong-il's kind of predilections for various fast cars and ladies and shoot-'em-up movies and that sort of stuff. So maybe it is that kind of sort of distorted view of what America stands for. And it's also the idea it's the Harlem Globetrotters. Like, it's farce. And maybe that's what he's so attracted to. This is my amateur psychology.
Okay, all right, I got it. Let's turn to the subject of Iraq. Of course, the 10th anniversary of the invasion is coming up very soon. You were embedded 3 times with Marine troops while you were there. Gosh, where do we start with the questions? First of all, what have we learned? Did we learn anything?
I think the question is, who is the we? I think if you're talking about the Iraqi people, I think they've learned the power and the deadliness, the lethality of counterinsurgency, as well as insurgency, as well as previously the pain and brutality of the Saddam regime. So I don't think that we can play politics with this. We can't say we liberated the Iraqis from Saddam, period, or that everything is completely despoiled and horrible and nothing right has happened. So I think for me, the legacy at this point for US policy leaders is really not all that much, because I don't think that we've disabused ourselves of the notion that we can solve all problems with military means. Drones, I mean, it's this idea that because we as a population are removed, generally speaking, from the consequences of our actions, we can kick down doors and shoot people in distant places, and there's no real constituency here in this country.
To that point,
to counter that.
To that point, and full disclosure, I'm an Air Force veteran. I served 4 years active duty in the Air Force. When you talk about being removed from the constituents, I would argue that not entirely, in that we have hundreds of thousands of military men and women who are returning home with wounds invisible to the eye in the forms of post-traumatic stress disorder, TBI, traumatic brain injury, and then obviously the physical wounds that we all can see. And to that end, granted, certainly not a huge segment of our population were directly involved in Iraq through their service in the military, but we are, as a people, still seeing and feeling the effects of that decision to go there.
I agree 100%, and the central character in my film is a Marine who's wrestling with PTSD. Dave Marino, I hope you're watching today. That said, I mean, we had over 4,000 people killed, American people, not counting the 100,000 plus Iraqis, but 4,000 US servicemen, servicewomen killed in Iraq. Where are they on the front pages? So,
and we have approximately 18 servicemen and women who are committing suicide almost every day,
highest suicide rate.
Administration. So more are dying stateside than they were in Iraq.
Which is something to pay attention to, but I don't think that's part of the discourse, which is my point. I think that we have a small population of military families and service members and contractors and so on and so forth who are deeply engaged in the consequences of the war, but we're not really engaged in, as a population, in much of anything else. And I don't think our leaders are learning the lessons of Iraq, which, counterinsurgency is a very, very different, very, very difficult, very dicey thing. When you go into someone else's country, pretend to understand the political system, and then tinker with it, you're playing with people's lives. And I think that's what's going on in Afghanistan. I think that's what's going on, what went on in Iraq. And if you read the cover of the Wall Street Journal today, you've got a ramped up CIA assistance to the special forces in Iraq, the counterterrorism units. Now,
but they're also filling the void following the fewer U.S. troops now in Iraq.
I want to get to, excuse me for interrupting, because I know you could go back and forth for the rest of the day about this, but and I want to correct myself, you were embedded with the troops in Afghanistan.
No, it was Iraq.
It was Iraq. Okay, I had it right the first time. But just tell me about your experiences with the minorities that were serving our country, and are they receiving the services, their needs being addressed appropriately, then and now?
Okay, well, quick response to Christina. There's a huge void that can't be filled by a few counterterrorism advisors, violence has did increase, instability increased after the U.S. troops pulled out in December 2011. No disrespect whatsoever to U.S. service members. U.S. service members couldn't stop an insurgency that, in fact, we ignited in 2004, 2005. So we should not expect special operations forces teams, however good they are, however lethal they are, to change the political calculus. In terms of minorities, people of color, I spent some time with some of the folks of color with the Marines. I was with Marine Combat Unit, which is disproportionately white, but you have Hispanics, you have black folks, and generally speaking, they call themselves green.
That's right.
They're Marines first. So it was very difficult to get people to parse the kind of domestic politics there when you're anticipating going outside the wire and possibly getting IED'd. The biggest divide that I found was actually American and Iraqi. I think there was a tendency, which is a tendency at war, for all Americans to kind of distance, separate, and to a degree dehumanize the enemy, the opponents. And I think cultural lack of understanding, historical lack of understanding, no language ability creates and preserves that divide. And just for me, I always found it kind of dangerously absurd that 19 and 20-year-olds were on the streets of Anbar province making policy decisions, what were essentially strategic decisions on the street. I understand that that's how war works, but this is actually counterinsurgency, which wasn't exactly a war.
It is
And also
mind-blowing. I'm sorry, we're going to have to be out of time. Maybe we can come back and discuss it just a little bit more later on in the show. But Brian Palmer, I want to thank you for joining us and being with us on our second day.
Thank
on
you
the
for
air.
having me.
We hope you come back.
All right, we do hope that you come back. We're going to move on now to Across Arise this morning, and we go to Colin Campbell in Washington with the latest on the Colorado rampage suspect. We also want to talk to him about the budget crisis and questions about the Congressional Black Caucus over the president's cabinet pick. Good day to you, Colin. So good to see you. So let's start off with this story about authorities giving James Holmes a truth serum. How did this come to be?
Good morning, Debbie. That's right. The judge in the case for James Holmes, the Colorado shooter, he would take what's called a narcoanalytic interview. And the judge said that this type of interview, which is allowed by law in Colorado, would lower James Holmes' inhibitions to test whether or not he is mentally insane. And he is expected to take that plea under the advisement of his defense attorneys to plead to mental insanity for the case that killed 12 people, injured about 70 others. He's facing 166 counts here. So it's very serious for James Holmes and what he defends himself as. So what this would do is allow the judge said that a chemist or a psychologist would allow the use of sodium pentothal or sodium amytal, I believe it's called. These two chemicals would lower Holmes's inhibitions to allow himself to speak more freely about the motivations behind his shooting and the bombs and booby traps that he set up at his apartment. This is somewhat unprecedented, so there aren't a lot of cases involving this technique, but it is allowed by Colorado law. And one more thing, the reason why this is so important and why this has been argued so much is because this is a death penalty case. So there is a lot of advisement for James Holmes' rights, and a lot of people are watching this under close eyes right now.
As you said, there has not been a lot of precedent for this, so this perhaps could be precedent setting. I'm sure a lot of eyes, particularly defense attorneys, will be watching this.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
All right. Let's move on to the next topic. House Budget Committee, Ryan Paul is proposing a budget solution that will likely be unfavorable to President Obama, and that is by cutting funds for the Affordable Care Act in order to make up the budget shortfall. Tell us how that's playing in Washington.
I hear the chuckle in your voice, and I detect what a lot of Americans are feeling like. It's the same old politics all over again. That's right. Paul Ryan wants to wants to introduce a budget that would cut spending about $46 trillion until 2023, and it would have the U.S. government spending about $41 trillion with 3.4% increases each year until that time. So this is something that Ryan says can be done in a decade. Strict austerity. Of course, this would come at the loss of the Affordable Care Act, but of course this is not going to happen. This is something coming out of the House. It's dead in the water as soon as it hits the Senate. Conversely, the Senate wants to introduce their own version of the bill tomorrow, Wednesday evening. That's expected to be dead in the water when it reaches the House. So really, it's the same old political gridlock that we're seeing here. It's going to be a long, hard battle to decide and make a final decision on what needs to be cut and if tax revenue will be raised. Of course, this is the major sticking point right now between the White House and Democrats and Republicans. If there is going to be new tax revenue introduced, if it was already decided upon in the fiscal cliff debate.
Absolutely. This falls into the category, I think, of you just can't make this stuff up in that regard. All right, Colin, so the president is taking heat from the Congressional Black Caucus. They are not happy with his cabinet picks. Tell me specifically, what's their beef?
Well, this is not just the Congressional Black Caucus, although they did submit to the White House a letter inquiring about the recent picks from the Obama administration. This is something that actually started during his first term, and some of the picks in his cabinet not really reflecting the diversity of the U.S. And I remember yesterday you talked a little bit about a post-racial America, and I think that there is this sentiment, particularly in the black community, that they would like to see more people representing them in the Obama administration. This is one of the reasons why it's believed that the president is pushing so hard for Susan Rice to become National Security Advisor after her failed attempt to become the next Secretary of State. It would represent a woman in his cabinet. It would also represent a minority. But of course, this is only one person. And the Congressional Black Caucus believes that there should be more people of color, more African Americans in the Obama administration, in his cabinet. We have not heard an official response from the White House as of yet.
All right. Colin Campbell joining us live from Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for that update. I do appreciate it. And I want to give our control room a heads up because I think we have a little bit extra time. And if we can, swing back to Negin, who had one final point that she wanted to make with Brian Palmer. We've got a little bit of time to do that. Negin, do you remember?
Well, I just wanted to ask about nation building and if there's any plans on making that any better. I know there's like a story about a $2.2 million chicken plant that was made in the middle of nowhere, Iraq, that relied on electricity, of which the country is not popular for right now. Right. So do you have any thoughts on nation building going forward?
If it's coming from the U.S. end, I don't think that there will be much more nation building. The Special Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction issued his last report recently, and it said that of the $60 billion that was spent on nation building, $8 billion was wasted. From my observations on the ground, and we're talking back in 2006, a lot more was wasted because you had Commander's Emergency Response Fund, operational commanders in particular places throwing money at Iraqi contractors, some corrupt, whatever. So I don't have much hope for that.
Well, that's grim.
On another point, of course, moving across the water a little bit from the Middle East to northern Africa, of course, there has been this Arab Spring that has been going on that seems to be falling down around them. What are your thoughts, both about the spring and then now the dismantling, it seems in some cases, for instance, in Algeria and even in Tunisia, about this falling apart, seemingly?
I cannot claim to be an expert, but what I can say is that I feel that many of these Arab Springs have been local, like responses to very particular local instances, particularly in Tunisia, the first one. The falling down, I think that's kind of inevitable. I mean, certain things can only be sustained for a while, particularly when you have authoritarian regimes ready to step in. There's been some talk in neocon circles that the Iraq miracle liberation had something to do with these Arab Springs. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find evidence for that. I think just we should also be looking at what's happening in Bangladesh now. There was kind of a Bengali Spring kind of thing happening, but it's being repressed. There's tremendous conflict between the two parties, the BNP and the Awami League. And I think we should really be focusing on this country of 160 million people in South Asia.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you,
You
Brian.
stopped all of a sudden. I was on the edge
No,
of my seat.
I wanted to say that because all of our attention tends to be on the Middle East, but Bangladesh has been a very interesting place for the past couple of years. The U.S. has taken really huge interest in it. And I just wanted to say, Negin, I saw pieces of your Muslims Are Coming, and I thought it was incredibly funny, but I also thought it was incredibly kind of profound and devastating because there's some real moments of tension between your comics and the people they're trying to laugh.
Make laugh.
Indeed,
laugh.
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Indeed, very insightful.
Yeah.
Again, I want to thank Brian
Thank you.
Palmer for your comments and your perspective, and thank you for jumping in. I appreciate that. Well, it's time for our first check of the business news of the morning. For that, we're going to go over to Chitra Nabat. Chitra?
Thank you, Debbie. The markets are off to a very strong start today. It's the fifth consecutive day of record highs. The Dow Jones, S&P, and NASDAQ are all riding this momentum. Investors are feeling confident from the recent positive economic news on job growth and the support the U.S. Central Bank is giving the economy. The market appears to be optimistic that President Obama and Congress will reach a resolution on the budget deficit before March 27th, which is the next critical milestone. Currently, the Dow Jones is up about 30 points to just over 14,400. The S&P is holding the line at just over 1,500, and the NASDAQ is just over 3,200. Is it possible for the SEC to charge a state for fraud? The Securities and Exchange Commission has charged the state of Illinois for securities fraud. They allege that Illinois did not give investors proper information around its pension funds. The state of Illinois agreed to settle with the SEC, but get this, they're not admitting to any wrongdoing, and there are no fines or penalties as part of this settlement. What's happened is investors bought about over $2 billion in municipal bonds between 2005 to 2009, but they weren't informed of the proper risks associated with these bonds. And that's because the state of Illinois was under some tricky financial condition because of underfunding in its pension plan system. And so what has now happened is they're settling, and the only other state to have been charged by the SEC was New Jersey in 2010 around similar issues. The Facebook CEO, Sheryl Sandberg, the Facebook Chief Operating Officer, Sheryl Sandberg, is under fire for a new book that she's just published called Lean In, Women, Work, and the Will to Lead. And she's being criticized for her views. She's saying that women should fight to be at the table, they should negotiate strongly just as the men do and smile when they do so. And she feels that they should share their domestic duties with the spouse or your partner 50-50. Sheryl Sandberg also feels that one of the reasons why there's only about 14% of women in top government and business positions is not only because of institutional sexism, but because women engage in unconscious self-sabotage. And that's a bit of some of the market news. Right now, we want to move to speaking about China. China is a very heavily debated topic, both China and the economy and its growth prospects. And so today, we've got with us Savio Chan. He's a top expert on doing business in China. He serves as President and Chief Executive Officer of U.S.-China Partners, which is a firm specializing in market entry, strategic sourcing, and marketing development in China for U.S. companies. Hi, Savio. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So, Savio, you're an expert on China. As you know, China is the second largest economy, and its growth prospects for this year are, GDP growing at about 7.5%, maybe a little bit more. Should companies, and specifically American companies, be really focused on getting into China?
Well, absolutely. If you look at all the numbers from AmCham of Shanghai and China, Chamber of Commerce from China, the numbers published, all the numbers is positive. The companies in America do business in China. They are all growing in sales, growing in profit. And that not only limited to the large companies, also the small and medium-sized companies are doing really well in China. But of course, the media in general has been having a negative spin on China. So that scared a lot of people away. But you have to really look through the smoke and understand the real issues and where the opportunities are. Do your homework, and there's a lot of opportunities in China.
Well, and I think to your point about a little bit of the smoke and mirrors, because if China is growing at about 7.5%, whereas the rest of the world, Europe, and particularly the United States, the outlook for this year is only about 2.5% growth in GDP. Who is China going to trade with? Because they're a big global trading economy, so that limits their prospects in a way. You talk about opportunities in China. What are some of the industries that could be ripe for opportunity for American companies?
Wow, that's a long list, actually. But if you look at the 12 5-year plan, that tell you a lot about what they're focusing on the Chinese economies. They are focusing on the renewable energies, technologies. Air pollution is a big problem, so if the technologies can help them clear the air in Beijing, they'll be great. And even services, technology services, legal services, consulting services. If you're an architect, it's perfect for that. I took a small law firm to China about 9 months ago, and they come back with a client. So, there are a lot of opportunity for all kinds of industry. We have to look at the plan and see what fit your role the best.
Do you think that American companies are pursuing opportunities that are different than, for example, African companies?
Well, it's a little bit different because they perceive us as a little bit different. They perceive us as a technology leader, have all the best technology. They perceive us as all the best, information about, consulting services, information services. So they look at us as a strong at different area, marketing, consulting, sales, negotiations. So all these things are what they perceive us as a leader in our economy. So that's different from the other countries, quite frankly.
So on the ground, if I'm an American company and I'm trying to now start my market entry into China, what are some of the steps that I should think about?
Well, I think the first thing you want to do is to partner with, look at the Department of Commerce. They have a free website called, export.gov. There's a huge section about China. It's a huge, guide for free you can download, 155 pages. It tells you about all the industry and all the do's and don'ts about doing business in China and how to be bicultural. You don't have to be bilingual. You don't need to speak Mandarin to do business in China. They do speak English. But knowing the culture, learning about what industry fit you the best, can you play to your strength in your business sector, and then you can find out the area you want to grow and find out where you want to grow. Because China is huge, And if you go to the south, it's different than going to the north or to the east. If you want to go to renewable energy or green energy, you go to the south. That's the area they designate to be for green energy, for example.
I want to talk about Apple for a second. I know rumor has it that the late Steve Jobs contacted you directly to help him get the Apple iPhone into China. How did that come about?
Well, I think that it was a funny story that about 4 or 5 years ago, when Apple was trying to get iPhone to sell in China, they needed a licensed partner to sell with them, and they've been making the phone in China for a long time. So one night I was working on my computer at night, because there were a 12-hour difference, as you know. Mm-hmm. And at 9:45, I saw an email coming through my screen from Steve Jobs. And he asked me about how do I get iPhone into China? After I said, wow, is that real Steve Jobs or is it somebody else make fun of me? But I found out it's the real Steve Jobs. And I guided Steve Jobs through email and said, hey, Steve, if you want to do a deal with China Mobile, it's not going to happen in the next 5 years. And here's the reason why. And if you want to do a deal with China Unicom, the next largest provider, you should do it now, and they'll be very open to it. And to his credit, he's very open-minded to even ask a guy like me, who's a small consultant, for advice.
Savio, we'll have to bring you back to talk more about this. We've got to move back over to Debbie. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
All right, thanks to both of you. Do appreciate it. Just ahead on Arise America. A 6-month-old Chicago girl is shot while her father was changing her diaper. We're going to bring you more on that story and a lot more when we come back. Don't go anywhere. This is Arise America. Welcome back to the second hour of Arise America on this Tuesday. I'm Debbie Turner Bell, along with Christina Brown, and she has the details of what we are covering this hour, which she will give to us in just a second. There is also a heartbreaking story out of Chicago, especially as this nation tries to grapple with a growing number of gun violence incidents. Later this hour, we will speak to two legal experts about the ramifications of the Supreme Court case examining the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And will a key part of this legislation be upheld? Also, we're going to have some business from our own Chitra Nabat, and she will give us the update on what's happening in the world of finance and business. So let's turn now to Christina. We have a really robust hour ahead of us, don't we?
Yeah, we certainly do. Not only are we going to be revisiting our Pope story that we tried to get to earlier, we're also going to be, as you said, we're going to be talking to two legal experts that are really going to weigh in and get into the weeds and give us the details, quite frankly, about the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and this case that the Supreme Court is reviewing. What is so critical about this particular story is that for so many people who do want to see this upheld, what the big concern is Section 5. And our legal experts, one a civil rights attorney, another an expert on constitutional law, will be able to kind of give us the background, the history of Section 5, why that particular component is actually the one most at risk, in this Supreme Court case. And quite frankly, Debbie, what it means for the civil rights legacy as well.
Absolutely. All right. Well, there is a breaking story right now, Christina. I don't know if you've heard about this. Odds makers have listed Italian Archbishop Angelo Scola as the new favorite in the papal sweepstakes ahead of the cardinals from Ghana and Brazil. But his candidacy has come under scrutiny today when anti-mafia detectives raided houses and homes in Milan, and that some of those houses are linked to some of Scola's closest associates. And one of the Cardinal Scola's oldest friends is a target, as a matter of fact, of the corruption investigation. I want to come back to you and chat with you just a bit, Christina, about this whole conclave and what's happening today. Of course, we had the opportunity to speak with Cardinal Napier earlier in the show, and it's so interesting that there are so many possible candidates for Pope.
Not only is it really fascinating the number of so-called front runners. By some reports, there's 10 front runners. You look at another report, there's 16 front runners. But what's particularly interesting about Scola is that Scola was really considered the favorite. There has been, of course, talk about possibly an African pope or an Asian pope, Tagle from the Philippines.
Or even an American
Or
pope.
even an American pope. But I think, though, with regards to the American pope, I think for the most part, as much as we in America might be rallying for that, given the history of the sex abuse scandal, the cover-up, and so on and so forth, most, or at least many, would say it would be tough to see an American pope. Doesn't mean that it would necessarily be any easier or any less likely for an African pope or an Asian pope. But with regards to Scola, he seemed to be the one that kind of fit the demographic, fit the ethnicity, the region. Mm-hmm. And so for this raid to occur on the day when the conclave begins, on the day when these cardinals actually make their first vote and cast their ballot, that makes it even that much more remarkable.
Yeah, it just got even more interesting.
It certainly did.
Nonetheless, it just got more interesting.
It certainly
we'll talk
did.
more about that, and certainly we're going to follow it like the rest of the world as the story develops. We're going to take a break right now. When we come back, we're going to talk about the Voting Rights Act and the case that's being heard before the Supreme Court and what the ramifications are for us. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
2/3 of the earth is water. Can you swim?
Let me tell you who to blame. Blame the boy lying at your feet, his body oozing life through the hole in his stomach where the bullet tore him apart. Blame him for challenging you, for not looking away and for not backing down when you pulled out the gun. Blame your mother for bringing you into this world when she was but a kid herself and for dragging you up, not bringing you up. Blame society for not giving you hope. Blame your father for not being there, the man who looked after himself instead of looking after you. Blame the gun in your hand for making you a target, for making you more likely to be picked on. Blame the dead boy, blame your mother, blame society, blame your father, blame the gun, blame anyone but yourself for not being strong enough to put down the gun, to break the cycle.
In 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed to prevent or correct discriminatory electoral practices. Such practices largely affected minorities, the poor, and residents of rural areas. Now, a case before the United States Supreme Court is challenging the constitutionality of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Such a ruling could put many, what many call the most effective piece of civil rights legislation in the U.S. history in jeopardy. Discussing and joining us to talk about the importance of the Voting Rights Act in this case before the Supreme Court is prominent civil rights attorney Sanford Rubenstein, who has represented Al Sharpton for over a decade, as well as Frederick Harris, a professor of political science and the director for the Institute for Research in African American Studies at Columbia University. Welcome to both of you. I almost can't believe we're having this conversation. I think that's where I want to start. I see you nodding your head right away, Professor Harris. Are you just blown away that we are even talking about the constitutionality of this piece of legislation that's so important in our history?
Yes, it's really remarkable. In fact, I just saw along your header today that the Edmunds Pettus Bridge is being commemorated and made a historical landmark. And for those of us who have a long historical memory, we know, for instance, that this year is the 50th anniversary of the Selma March across the Edmunds Pettus Bridge. And it was really symbolic of the need for the protection of African American voters. So here we are 50 years later after a contested presidential election where you had many states trying to suppress the minority vote. And so Section 5, I think, is very, very interesting. I would like to see, actually, Section 5 be viewed on a more of a national level because it's, at the moment, concentrated in the Deep South states. And so we can come back to that, but I think it's quite remarkable that we're addressing this today.
One of the things that I think we have to understand is what Section 5 actually does.
That was my next question.
What Section 5 does is it requires pre-clearance by the Justice Department or a panel of federal judges with regard to any change states that have had problems in terms of voters' rights.
And give us an example of that kind of change that one might ask for.
For example, let's take the real issue. The guts of it is polling places. Let's say a jurisdiction, a state, a city, a town, wants to create different polling places than already exist. Well, presently, that state would have to go to the Justice Department or a 3-judge federal panel and ask for permission to make that change. Whereas if Section 5 were considered unconstitutional, then that wouldn't exist. Now, there are many who say, let's go to Section 2. Section 2 allows individuals and the Justice Department to file lawsuits when issues involving voter rights arises. However, it changes the burden. It puts the burden on the government as opposed to the municipality in terms of whether or not this change will create unfair voting practices. So it's not a good substitute, although it was argued by some of the conservative judges that it might be. I don't believe it is.
Yeah. But also another aspect of Section 5 has to do with the redrawing of districts every 10 years as a result of the census. And so the provisions of the Civil Rights Act, after 1965, required that if all possible, you draw legislative districts that give the opportunity of minority voters to elect a legislator or elected official of their choice. And so what this has done is create a situation where we've had an explosion of black elected officials and Latino officials in these covered districts that in many ways not only protect the voting rights, but give also minorities an opportunity to elect a representative of their own. One cannot imagine, for instance, the election of Barack Obama as president of the United States without the Voting Rights Act and those protections that's covered under Section 5.
Absolutely, which certainly did kick in this election in states like Texas and South Carolina.
But some critics, or those who say may support the removal of Section 5, might argue that because an African-American president has been elected, then therefore this particular provision of the Voting Rights Act is no longer necessary.
You know, you could take it even further and say, well, if in fact problems with voting are not as bad today as they were many years ago, we don't need to go to the Justice Department because the problem's been solved. That argument is being made saying, well, not that many cases were brought before the Justice Department, not that many requests were made. And it appears to me the reason for that was because the statute works by being in existence, by a municipality or a state having to go to the federal government or a three-judge panel when they want to change something will mean if their intent is to change something to make it harder for black people to vote, for example, they're not going to go with that change. So what this has done, Section 5, it's acted as a deterrent to problems in terms of voters' rights. And the argument's being made, well, the fact that not that many complaints are being made and not that many changes are being made means you don't need it. That's not true. It's needed to be a deterrent.
Right, and it means it's working. But also what's remarkable about this is in 2006, when you had to, when the Voting Rights Act was pushed again to be ratified, is that you had bipartisan support from Democrats and Republicans, and in fact, unanimous support by the members of the Senate.
But Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia would argue that no one would dare be on the record and not support this because of the political ramifications. Almost saying as though, for some, their heart wasn't really in it.
Well, the truth is, though, but the Congress even issued a statement affirming that decision after it was reaffirmed in Congress in 2006, as you so eloquently stated. But now, if you're listening for a Republican legislator,
they're nowhere to be found.
It's crickets.
It's to that point that Scalia called it a racial entitlement.
Right.
Voting is not a racial entitlement. Voting is the right of every American.
Absolutely. Now, Sanford, will you take us back to high school civics class for just a second and explain, I know what your position is about this case, but explain the legal justification that brought this case before the Supreme Court. How did it get this far?
Congress made a determination that there were disparities in voting because of race. So they passed this act to protect the right of individuals to vote. Now it's being attacked as unconstitutional by Shelby County, saying that we're being discriminated against because we don't have these kind of problems. Yet, in fact, one of the more liberal Supreme Court judges said clearly that the reason we need the act is because while the problem might not be statewide, a problem does exist in Shelby County.
But I still don't understand the legal rationale behind that.
The legal rationale behind this lawsuit is that this section is unconstitutional because the problem doesn't exist anymore. And that's what's being argued.
It still doesn't make sense.
But also there's the other point about the formula that's being used for the covered jurisdictions under Section 5, is that the formula is too old. It comes from the early 70s. And that, so the question is that, you have these voter violations based on something that happened in the past. And the question is that, well, there are other things that are happening outside of Section 5 jurisdictions. Why are these states or these counties in some instances being treated differently? And so the interesting question for me, as I raised earlier, well, that may be the case. Maybe the formula from the early 70s have to be, recalculated because it meant that those under Section 5 at the time, around 65, had less than 50% of voters registered, right? And clearly that's not the situation today. I would like to see actually the Voting Rights Act or Section 5 expanded out of those jurisdictions.
So you don't think it goes far enough as it stands now?
Well, if you look in cases in states like Pennsylvania, right, doing
or Ohio,
or Ohio, these are states that are not covered under Voting Rights Act or Section 5 in particular, and so it seems to me that there has to be some rethinking. You know, states do have the opportunity to bail out. So for me, I think it's an interesting constitutional question. Is that why isn't that the state of Alabama, or has it asked for a bailout because it's been on good behavior for the past 20 years, which is the rule?
The other thing we should point out is only 9 states are covered presently as states that have to get permission. But the other interesting aspect of this case that was argued before the Supreme Court is who actually makes the decision whether a statute such as this is needed. Should it be Congress or should it be the court? And the court was divided on that issue as well. It seems to me that Congress, the elected representatives of the people of this country, should be the ones making this determination, not the court.
When you talk about the difficulty, the challenges that were put in place for some people to vote, explain to us what are the methods that are being used now as, say, in comparison decades ago? What are the challenges that people might have in trying to vote?
Well, there was just mentioned them a few minutes ago by the good lawyer here, but as a political scientist, if anybody was paying attention to what's happening in the last presidential election, you know that there were these enormous requirements put up for voter registration. There were instances where voter registration groups were given all these sort of regulations about what they could and could not do. Long lines, these sorts of things.
So in some cases, for example, they might have to produce a birth certificate.
You know, a state-issued ID, particularly for elderly African Americans, or you know, people in rural locales generally around the country, who may have been, you know, weren't born in a hospital. They wouldn't have a birth certificate. So this put this undue burden on voters in order to, you know, have the ability to register and vote. Now, in the past, things were used like literacy tests, right? Or, you know, if you would go to a poll, a registrar would ask you how many bubbles there are in a bar of soap, right? Clearly, schemes that were used to undermine the ability of African Americans to vote, which go back in 65, you know, you have to remember, it took almost 100 years to correct the things that were put in during Reconstruction in the mid to late 19th century. And so here we go again, you know, this sort of easing away of these voter protections. And it will be, you know, unfortunate, I think, if the Voting Rights Act in Section 5 is taken away.
Well, and if it were, what's the likelihood that this Section 5 would be declared unconstitutional?
Well,
and if it is, what happens next?
It seems to me this statute will go the way Kennedy goes. Because it seemed from the argument that the 4 conservative judges were clearly defined how they were going to vote. 4 liberal judges kind of defined how they were going to vote. And it seems that Kennedy, the swing vote, is going to be the deciding factor. I try to discern from the argument which way it is going, and it's just impossible. So time will tell. But clearly, I think there's going to be a 5-4 decision.
Yeah, I do too. But, you know, I think what's going to happen, I mentioned this formula, and I think people are going to, the justices are going to hone in on that point. And what they're going to do, which I think is going to be partly unfortunate, is they're going to send it back to Congress to fix it. And the question will be, will a Republican-dominated Congress in the poisonous atmosphere we're in right now do anything about it? If they don't do anything about it, it seems that, you know, we can have complications down the line.
I think that it's a very likely scenario that this goes back to Congress because of the argument that was made before the court that this determination should be made by Congress. And if changes have to be made in the law, if the law has to be tweaked in some way to cover more states, for example, one of the points that was made during argument was, well, it's just not right because a state that has no problems today is required to get preclearance. Yet a state that does have problems now, that didn't have problems before, doesn't have to get preclearance because it's limited to the 9 states. So it may very well go back to Congress for a more comprehensive bill. Whether that can get passed or not is a question that we won't know the answer to until Congress acts. If that's
If
what the
they
Supreme
add.
Court does.
If
If that's
they
what
add.
the
They may
Supreme
not
Court
add.
does. But on the other
You're
hand,
right. You're absolutely right.
On the other hand, Kennedy goes the other way. Section 5 could be declared unconstitutional. And then you only have Section 2 left, which I said earlier requires lawsuits, which are lengthy, and doesn't give you the pre-clearance requirement, which I believe has acted as a deterrent to schemes to keep the voter from voting.
Let's broaden this discussion out a little bit. The fact that this case has been brought before the Supreme Court took the case, and now it's being argued, and it remains to be seen what the ruling will be. What's the commentary on the issue of race relations and where we are in 2013 in this country as it relates to race and isms, if you will?
Well, I would say you still have issues in terms of disparities in healthcare, disparities in employment, disparities in wages. They're still very real. So the fact that we have a black president in America doesn't mean that civil rights issues that have been fought for generations and generations don't continue to have to be fought as well.
We just have a few seconds left. I know you want to say something.
I will agree. We're in the tale of two cities. I think there's a segment of black America that's doing very well. You mentioned disparities in income. I think disparities in wealth are growing enormously, just not for African Americans, among African Americans, but among Americans in general. And so, unfortunately, I think that we still need these protections, these civil rights protections. And by the way, there's another Supreme Court decision that's come along around affirmative action. So it will be interesting to see, and they're both coming this spring, what the consequences would be in the years ahead if they're negative decisions.
All right. Well, I want to hear more about that. I also want to hear your perspective about the state of black activism and what the election of President Obama has to do with that. So if you guys will sit tight, we want to keep you around, have a little bit more discussion. Is that all right with you? We're going to take a quick break, though. Still ahead, what is the word from Wall Street and the rest of the global markets? We'll have that from our Chicha Nabat and much more. So you have to stick around to find out what that is. We'll be right back.
2/3 of the earth is water. Can you swim?
Let me tell you who to blame. Blame the boy lying at your feet, his body oozing life through the hole in his stomach where the bullet tore him apart. Blame him for challenging you, for not looking away and for not backing down when you pulled out the gun. Blame your mother for bringing you into this world when she was but a kid herself and for dragging you up, not bringing you up. Blame society for not giving you hope. Blame your father for not being there, the man who looked after himself instead of looking after you. Blame the gun in your hand for making you a target, for making you more likely to be picked on. Blame the dead boy, blame your mother, blame society, blame your father, blame the gun, blame anyone but yourself for not being strong enough to put down the gun, to break the cycle.
A 6-month-old baby girl is in critical condition after a drive-by shooting in Chicago that also sent her father to the hospital with multiple wounds. The pair were hit as he was changing the child's diaper. Hit by a gunshot. The shooting took place at Chicago's South Side, and the two were inside a minivan yesterday afternoon when the shots were fired. Several suspects are being questioned. The shooting follows a rally by funeral home directors and morticians to protest gun violence, which many are calling an epidemic in Chicago. 506 people were killed by guns in Chicago in 2012. 44 people have died this year alone, and remember, we're only 2.5 months into the year, according to the website colorlines.com. The New York Times reports that a majority of the homicides are taking place in neighborhoods west and south of Chicago's downtown. We want to talk about this a little bit more with the guests that we have here at the table, at our round table with us, and that is civil rights attorney Sanford Rubenstein and Columbia University Professor Frederick Harris. Thank you for sticking around with us.
Look, as a New Yorker who sees gun violence almost on a daily basis, there has to be legislation on a federal level to get a handle on gun violence in this country. And the power that the NRA has with members of Congress, with the Senate, has to be attacked by common sense. And the fact that elected representatives get elected to do the good for everybody, not just those who want to see more guns as opposed to less guns. So the truth of the matter is we have to get Congress to act and pass a statute to get to the guns at their source to stop this violence. It's as simple as that.
What additional legislation do you think needs to be in place that rules on the book, if enforced, properly enforced?
Well, clearly, first of all, assault weapons. It is outrageous that assault weapons, the assault weapon ban has not been reenacted. That's step one. And then step two is you have to have anyone who buys a gun, whether it's at a gun sale, at a fair, register that gun and have clearance checks. That has to be done in this country because it's totally out of control and it's unacceptable. And we shouldn't be living where parents live in fear of their kids getting shot randomly.
You know, it's so interesting because the NRA has a new outreach, a new campaign. I don't know if you guys have heard about it, reaching out to African Americans as it relates to gun ownership, which is a flip-flop for them because back in the 50s and certainly 60s, when black activists like the Black Panthers wanted to carry guns on the street, it was the NRA said, wait a minute, we can't give everybody guns. And so it's sort of an interesting flip-flop.
The tide has changed.
Well, it's interesting. I sort of joke around with my students at Columbia. I say the best way to get gun control in this country is arm a bunch of Black Panthers and have them march around Congress. And so, yeah, I think it's absolutely needed. And in fact, I think there should be more short-term drastic measures when it comes to Chicago. I actually think that the National Guard should be put in because clearly what we see here is not only a city in crisis, we see a national crisis. And I think each American should be concerned about what's going on the south side of Chicago. It's happening everywhere, but the concentration of that type of violence. And we also need to pay far more attention to the symptoms of all this. I mean, these are very desperately poor communities on that. I used to live in Chicago, so I'm very familiar with the west side and the south side of Chicago. And so what we have there is, particularly when we're having widening inequality, we have sort of the erosion of schools. Who's really paying attention to the 50% dropout rate, particularly of African American men? And so we keep putting bandages on all these problems, but I think there needs to be a multiple-pronged approach to the issue of gun violence.
And there is an effort afoot in Chicago, doctors and researchers that are trying to make the gun violence incidents in Chicago ruled a public health issue. Right. 2 months into 2013, and they've already exceeded the number of homicides related to gun violence this year as compared to last year at this time.
That's really a provocative proposal that you have, because sometimes sending in the National Guard has not always had the desired effect in our youth, in our history. You have to agree.
You know, if I can go back to the issue, I think another thing that has to be done is you have to enforce the existing gun control laws. For example, in New York, there's a statute that creates mandatory jail for possession of a handgun. Yet, people take pleas, and they plead to something less than the main charge, so they don't have that mandatory jail to deal with. The courts, the judges have to be stricter in terms of enforcing the gun control laws that are already on the books.
What legislation, very quickly, because we're almost out of time, what piece of legislation do you think that can be proposed on gun control that could actually get through Congress?
Perhaps banning assault weapons. I think that it was done in the 1990s with Clinton. I hope it gets through, but I don't think it's really going to do much. I think it's going to have a real...
It didn't do much before.
It didn't do much before. Modest sort of changes. But I actually think that there needs to be again, a concentration on what these symptoms are. And also policing. I mean, I come on both sides of this. There can be too much aggressive policing, as you surely know.
New York stop and frisk.
Yeah, I'm not proposing that, but there has to be some degree of strong presence, because those children, the people in those communities, need to be protected. And so that's why I'm proposing this radical view of the...
Yeah, well, sometimes desperate times do call for desperate measures.
Exactly.
I will give you that. We're going to have to leave it right there, of course. This debate is going to rage on far beyond this table. We thank you so much, Sanford Rubenstein, as well as Professor Frederick Harris, for being with us. We appreciate it. Well, I promised you some business news, and now it's that time. We're going to go to our business anchor, Chitra Nabat. Chitra?
Thank you, Debbie. Latin American investors are keen on hot and sunny Miami. It was only 3 years ago that Florida, like other parts of the U.S., were hurting from the housing bust. Wealthy Latin Americans have invested in property in Florida for a long time. South American developers from Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, and Venezuela are now boosting the housing market. They recognize that Latin Americans are looking for a stable place to put their money and earn property rental income. There were recent currency devaluations in Argentina, in Brazil, and Venezuela. And there are fears that those currencies may continue to weaken. And this drives investors to wanting hard assets like real estate. Over a third of the development projects in Miami right now are by Latin American developers who are also attracted to the Latin flavor of the city. In some global mergers and acquisitions developments, New York-based private equity firms Carlyle Group and KKR, the big giants, are bidding to buy a minority stake in Thai Life Insurance Company. This deal is worth approximately $500 million. With global banks, Goldman Sachs, they've been hired by the Germany utility company RWE AG to sell its oil and exploration gas unit. One of the largest American banks, Citibank, has been mandated, along with Danske Bank, to help the firm Fortum sell its power grid. Fortum is a Finnish state-controlled utility, and the deal may be worth around $6.5 billion. Now we're going to cross over and speak with our global business editor, Michael Wilson, for an update on what's happening in the rest of the world. Greetings, Michael. How are you? Michael, are you there?
Thank you. It's a little chilly here, not quite as chilly as New York is probably, but it looks very sunny behind me, but don't be fooled. It's very, very cold indeed. And actually, sterling's caught a bit of a cold today at its lowest rate now since 2008, since the beginning of the financial crisis. And the reason for that is we had some dreadful industrial production figures out in this country this morning. And really, the one-way bet as far as sterling is concerned is right downwards. We're nearly at parity with the euro, i.e. £1 buys €1, and it could go even further. But the London market, the stock market, well, they don't care too much about a weak pound, because a weak pound can help companies export, so it doesn't necessarily mean disaster for that. And euro stocks are actually trading in a very narrow range too. Remember, these stocks have come up massively, thanks a lot to the United States, really, for those great jobs figures we had from you on Friday. As far as South Africa is concerned, now this is a bad one for them. South Africa are out of step with the amazing growth figures in the rest of the continent. Their current account deficit is widest for 4 years. The rand is falling down again. Now, you might think a weak currency is good news. It's not as far as South Africa is concerned, because the rand has been so volatile that it's been affecting corporate performance. And it underscores a lot of the problems in South Africa at the moment, particular bad labour relations and continuing strikes in the mining industry. Kenya, though, well, you saw the result in inverted commas of the election there. As it was peaceful, that's given a bit of a green light, really, to the markets. The stock market again today up the highest for 4.5 years. I was telling you, Chitra, yesterday about what I thought about gold. That continues to sink, not hugely, but its bull run of 12 years is over. George Soros, the billionaire investor, the latest to sell about 50% of one of his recent gold funds. So that really are the markets around the world so far.
Michael, you know, earlier in the program today here in New York, we were talking with an expert on cross-border with China. And I know that in Nigeria, there's been discussions about or perceptions around China colonizing Africa.
That's right, yes. Lamido Sanusi, who's the central bank governor, is in the Financial Times today, our financial newspaper here, or an international one as well, of course, you probably know. And he was saying that, well, South Africa itself needs to be careful with the romance with China. China gets a third of its oil from Africa. It gets copper and other minerals too. The relationship's been a bit indiscriminate in the past. When China could portray itself as being a developing economy, then it had a lot in common with Africa. They could both rub along saying, look, we're both in the same boat together. That now has all changed. China is a developed nation. Its urbanization program has still got years ahead of it. And the thought is that certainly a number of Africans are thinking, well, what kind of relationship do we actually have with China now? Is it as equal partner, or do they want to come in and exploit what we actually have here? Is it a savior? Is it a partner? I read his words. It is a model for us. No, says the central bank governor of Nigeria, it is not. Africa needs to stand on its own 2 feet and also defend itself against cheap China imports. So there's a shift going on here. What many Africans are worried about, the kind of relationships developing between Chinese politicians and African ones. Africa, to save itself, must stand alone. That's the gist of what he's saying. And I think we're going to hear a lot more of this over the months and years to come. It's a big issue as far as Africa is concerned. Chitra.
Well, Michael, he definitely has strong views, because I know his languaging around China contributing to the deindustrialization and underdevelopment of Africa are pretty strong statements. Moving on to Angola, the middle class there, they want more economic rights. What's happening?
Well, they are clamoring for housing. Now, again, the Chinese have been involved in developing a number of small cities in Angola. Remember that Angola, fantastically rich country, yes, 11 years after civil war, still developing and so on, but it has huge oil reserves and it's developing those. So the government has actually now, as far as this property development or real estate development is concerned, has put a lid on the top price of houses that are being built to $190,000 and $70,000 for the slightly cheaper ones. And people are actually clamoring for these. Economic growth in Angola, 7.1%. It's a classic developing African country, vast riches underneath it, vast riches in hands of some people, not so many riches in the hands of others, but a developing middle class. And really, if you think about it, that's where the survival of Africa is going to come from. If I can tell you that to rent a 4-bedroom house in Luanda, the capital, is $15,000. A 2-bedroom apartment a week is $6,500. Compare with London, $4,400. New York, $4,500. And a hamburger on the streets of Luanda, this is development for you, now $20. So there's a lot going on in that country. I suspect those prices have got quite a long way to go.
But is that considered $20? Is that considered a progress? Because I know Angola had elections last year, right? So is this, how are they really moving things along for the middle class?
Well, what they're doing is they're making things available and they're developing their own industries fairly rapidly, again with Chinese help. They want to have a balanced economy, not just dependent on oil. They want to be dependent on agriculture as well. But there's a lot of riches around and some of it's actually being shared. Now, the example of the hamburger is probably an extreme one, but it does exist. Those prices obviously will have to come down. People can't pay that kind of money. But it's a very, very expensive place to live. And as far as expatriates are concerned, it's the most expensive place in Africa. So it's got a long way to go until those prices sort of marginalise and come down to something that keeps the standard of living at a reasonable cost, I think, Chitra.
Now, I understand with HP, they've made a filing with the UK Serious Fraud Office. What's taking place? Okay, so
Hewlett-Packard bought this software company called Autonomy, a very well-known one here. They bought it for $10.3 billion in 2011. They've had to put a write-down on it of $8.8 billion because they found that everything, well, they didn't really find it was what it said it was. Now, whether this is a problem with due diligence, whether HP actually knew what they were doing, we don't know, because now it's in the hands of the Serious Fraud Office. I understand the FBI in New York is also probably going to investigate it. But it calls into issue the whole point, about Hewlett-Packard, which has made some terrible acquisitions over the years. They're wrestling with that. They're wrestling with the fact that not only did they botch those, but they clearly completely misunderstood the demand, or lack of it, for PCs. Many of their shareholders have launched class actions against Hewlett-Packard to criticize them for making this purchase and many others like it in the past. And a lot of those shareholders are saying, you've got to get rid of the senior management. Well, that's all very well if you're looking for scapegoats, but you can't just leave a company like Hewlett-Packard with no people actually running it. So this is just early days yet, but it's worth marking, because Hewlett-Packard was a real big name as far as PCs are concerned, now very, very different.
Michael, thank you so much for that update. And now we turn it back to Debbie.
So let's start off with this story about authorities giving James Holmes a truth serum. How did this come to be?
Good morning, Debbie. That's right. The judge in the case for James Holmes, the Colorado shooter, he would take what's called a narcoanalytic interview. And the judge said that this type of interview, which is allowed by law in Colorado, would lower James Holmes' inhibitions to test whether or not he is mentally insane. And he is expected to take that plea under the advisement of his defense attorneys to plead to mental insanity for the case that killed 12 people, injured about 70 others. He's facing 166 counts here. So it's very serious for James Holmes and what he defends himself as. So what this would do is allow the judge said that a chemist or a psychologist would allow the use of sodium pentothal or sodium amytal, I believe it's called. These two chemicals would lower Holmes's inhibitions to allow himself to speak more freely about the motivations behind his shooting and the bombs and booby traps that he set up at his apartment. This is somewhat unprecedented, so there aren't a lot of cases involving this technique, but it is allowed by Colorado law. And one more thing, the reason why this is so important and why this has been argued so much is because this is a death penalty case. So there is a lot of advisement for James Holmes' rights, and a lot of people are watching this under close eyes right now.
As you said, there has not been a lot of precedent for this, so this perhaps could be precedent setting. I'm sure a lot of eyes, particularly defense attorneys, will be watching this.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
All right. Let's move on to the next topic. House Budget Committee, Ryan Paul is proposing a budget solution that will likely be unfavorable to President Obama, and that is by cutting funds for the Affordable Care Act in order to make up the budget shortfall. Tell us how that's playing in Washington.
I hear the chuckle in your voice, and I detect what a lot of Americans are feeling like. It's the same old politics all over again. That's right. Paul Ryan wants to introduce a budget that would cut spending about $46 trillion until 2023, and it would have the U.S. government spending about $41 trillion with 3.4% increases each year until that time. So this is something that Ryan says can be done in a decade. Strict austerity. Of course, this would come at the loss of the Affordable Care Act, but of course this is not going to happen. This is something coming out of the House. It's dead in the water as soon as it hits the Senate. Conversely, the Senate wants to introduce their own version of the bill tomorrow, Wednesday evening. That's expected to be dead in the water when it reaches the House. So really, it's the same old political gridlock that we're seeing here. It's going to be a long, hard battle to decide and make a final decision on what needs to be cut and if tax revenue will be raised. Of course, this is the major sticking point right now between the White House and Democrats and Republicans. If there is going to be new tax revenue introduced, if it was already decided upon in the fiscal cliff debate.
Absolutely. This falls into the category, I think, of you just can't make this stuff up in that regard. All right, Colin, so the president is taking heat from the Congressional Black Caucus. They are not happy with his cabinet picks. Tell me specifically, what's their beef?
Well, this is not just the Congressional Black Caucus, although they did submit to the White House a letter inquiring about the recent picks from the Obama administration. This is something that actually started during his first term, and some of the picks in his cabinet not really reflecting the diversity of the U.S. And I remember yesterday you talked a little bit about a post-racial America, and I think that there is this sentiment, particularly in the black community, that they would like to see more people representing them in the Obama administration. This is one of the reasons why it's believed that the president is pushing so hard for Susan Rice to become National Security security advisor after her failed attempt to become the next Secretary of State. It would represent a woman in his cabinet. It would also represent a minority. But of course, this is only one person. And the Congressional Black Caucus believes that there should be more people of color, more African Americans in the Obama administration, in his cabinet. We have not heard an official response from the White House as of yet.
All right, Colin Campbell joining us live from Washington, D.C.
And coming up, we'll preview Arise Entertainment 360.
Five questions. Some friends show up unexpectedly for dinner. What's in your fridge?
What's in my fridge to eat?
That's usually what things that go into a fridge.
Because right now there's mold.
Nice.
No, green apples, and I'm embarrassed to say this, there are also Cracker Jacks. I know. Cracker Jacks.
Chilled
old
Cracker Jacks?
school Cracker
Those
Jacks.
are
Yeah,
good. Chilled
I like them
Cracker
cold
Jacks.
and crunchy.
All right,
I used
that's
to eat
good.
them a lot when I was a kid, so they bring me comfort in times of stress.
Bring some in. Who has the better haircut, Charlize Theron or Anne Hathaway?
Ooh, Charlize Theron or Anne Hathaway. Well, they're both rocking short dues. Charlize's hair is really, really short, and you've got to have a beautiful face to pull that off. So I think I'm going to give it to Charlize, even though I love
It's a
Anne
close call.
Hathaway's raven-haired number. I mean, her hair's so thick and lush. That's a hard one. I'll give it to Charlize, though.
Okay, I'll defer to you on that one.
Okay.
How much did you spend on your last splurge, and what was it?
I'm standing on them. I won't tell you how much they cost because I've lied to my husband about how much they cost. But let's just say they were 3 figures, and none of them started with 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. Sorry, honey.
What movie always makes you cry?
What movie always makes me cry? Color Purple.
Oh,
Yeah,
good choice.
Color Purple. That's a tearjerker. Makes me laugh, makes me cry. Yeah, that's a
It's
good
got
one.
it all. So, name 5 people you cannot believe you're not friends with. Other than me, we'll become friends.
Okay, well, now that you're off the list, I can't believe we're friends. That's so cool. Who am I not friends with? Well, I can't believe Beyonce and I aren't friends because she's a Virgo and I'm a Virgo, so naturally we should be BFFs. And we both have amazing bodies. Just kidding. Who
And you're
else?
both singing for Michelle Obama's 50th anniversary.
It's true.
Your
That's
birthday.
true. I can't believe I'm not friends with Michelle Obama. I've interviewed her twice, and she likes me, but we're not homegirls yet. But third interview, I'm locking that down. Can't believe I'm not friends with Dave Chappelle because anything he says is funny, and I just love hearing his voice. It just tickles my ear. So I can't believe we're not friends. And I can't believe I'm not friends with Tina Fey. I loved 30 Rock. I feel like all of her jokes directly speak to me. We have a very similar sense of humor, and I know she'd crack me up all day long. So I can't believe I'm not friends with any of those people. But I will be. I'm working on it. They're on my friend bucket list. I'm going to lock it down.
We'll check back with you next year.
Okay.
And that's 5 questions.
And oh, by the way, you will see more of those. All of us did those 5 questions, and boy, don't you learn something about the people
You
when you do that. Well, of course, here on Arise America, we talk about news of the day, topical issues, you know, weighty, meaty, sometimes philosophical issues. But we have another show in the Arise family called Arise 360 Entertainment, where you get to talk about the fun stuff, and that's what we're about to do, right, Christina?
That's certainly right, Debbie. And joining us now is Shannon Lanier from Arise Entertainment 360 for a preview of today's show. Who can you not believe that you're friends with?
I know, right? Obama. You know, I can't believe I have that.
You and Barry
privilege.
don't golf together.
Lola's like, why hasn't Michelle called me back?
I know. I've been tweeting her every day.
Well, what she doesn't know is she's been calling me.
Oh, okay now.
Not at all, no.
What do you guys have on tap today?
Oh, well, it's an exciting day. Of course, we're going to have all your entertainment news and culture, everything that we gossip about and talk about, and it's rumored. We're going to have all that information. Plus, we're going to dedicate today's show to arising to your health. So a lot of health and fitness things. We're going to talk, of course, about the New York mayor, Michael Bloomberg. He has this big ban he's trying to put out on large sugary drinks. The judge is trying to knock it down. So we're going to talk about what would happen if it did pass and what are some of the healthy alternatives that we could turn to instead of all that sugar. We're also going to have all the latest diet crazes. You know, there's tons of diets. I know. Have you guys tried any great diets?
I have tried every diet known to man. I'm serious.
The most recent?
Grapefruit,
oh my God.
Dukin diet.
That's the one that I tried, was
banana
the
and
Dukin
milk
diet.
Lemonade?
I tried
Lemonade.
the Dukin.
I had
The 5 and 2?
5 and 2. I don't know that.
Okay, so we got a new
Wait,
one for
what's
you.
the 5 and 2?
Now you got to watch the show. You got to watch the show. It's coming up later today.
I tried Dukin. I lasted for
Okay.
about a week.
Oh, okay. See, and
There's all kinds. I mean, there's just all kinds out there.
so we're going
tried
to talk
every one.
about some of those and talk about the pros and cons of doing some of those diets. So it's going to be pretty interesting.
Tell me about the 5 and 2, in case I'm busy.
Oh gosh.
Shut your mouth.
No, I
You're
was
gonna
watching
be
with
glued.
bated breath.
You're going to be glued to
Well,
the
it's one
screen
of Lola's
watching.
favorites where basically you can eat whatever you want 5 times a week.
Oh, I like
but
that one.
Oh, and
2
be good for
days
2
of the
days.
week you have to be good.
Oh,
2
honey,
non-consecutive
if I could do that,
days.
I wouldn't need a diet.
I know, right? But it's still a matter of, you know, there's the controversy if it's even healthy, because if you're eating 500 calories, I think it is, 500 calories for 2 days a week, is that really healthy? So we're going to talk about some of that stuff, and, you know, some of the ones that celebrities are trying as well. So that's always a big topic for people, what, you know, celebrities are doing.
Are you familiar with the 1 apple and a bite of Snicker bar a day diet?
Yeah, it doesn't sound very healthy. Is that?
Man was
like a 10-year-old
But you know what? It does sound tasty.
Well, the Snicker was what I lived for, and it kept me from fainting dead out every time I stood up from a chair. But I did that to get, I have this tainted background
Gotta be
in pageants.
careful because, you know,
I was
the sugar
young
levels
and
are bouncing
stupid.
up and you start crashing, you're sleeping on the desk.
Yeah, I'm
and
familiar
like,
with all that. Yeah, but I was
But you know
in my
what?
20s.
You did it for a worthy cause. You won Miss America.
Now, see, I wasn't going to say all that.
Well, I'll say it.
Yeah.
It worked. It
Yeah.
worked.
that way
It
to
helped,
go?
but I promptly gained 10 pounds the next day when I ate every cheeseburger I could find.
I did that before. You know, there was actually a trick, and you may know this about eating dry oatmeal. Like before you go on, because it soaks up all the water in you and it
No, I don't know
shreds
about
you.
this.
Yeah, I tried that
Listen.
one back in my modeling day. I wasn't Mr. America or anything, but
you
know,
could be.
yeah.
No gain without the pain, right?
Yeah, exactly.
We do what we have to do.
I'm too old to even worry about it now. What
Well,
else do you
there's
have?
another thing that's going around. It's called leech therapy. Have you heard of this? It's an old Egyptian thing that is where you put leeches on your body to heal certain elements, and they soak up the blood.
Does it hurt?
We're going to find out today. Because Lola is going to actually put some leeches on
Oh
her body.
my goodness.
Oh, really?
Yes, she's
my
going to
goodness.
put leeches on her body,
She is
everybody.
daring.
Yes.
She's putting them all over her body.
I don't know about that. Let's not go too far. Maybe she'll do 1. But I'm going to try to at least get her to do 2. We'll see what happens.
Oh,
but
wow.
yeah, there's
Okay.
this new thing, and like to cure varicose veins and all these different elements, they say it helps. The guy who's coming in to talk about it, he actually put 4 of them on his daughter's gums when she needed a root canal. She's like, she doesn't need a root canal, just try leeches.
Did it work for him?
It worked. It worked.
Okay.
I don't know if I can go that
I
far.
wouldn't recommend that at home, but this is what I want to know. Why is Lola putting the leash on her. What about the big man?
Hey, you know, she wanted to. I said, you know, go for it. You know, it's supposed to help keep you younger, and all Demi Moore is doing it. So Lola said, you know, she's one of the celebrities like they are. So I said, okay.
Oh, is she now? Okay.
Yeah, yeah. If she
You
starts
didn't
to
wanna
cry,
be rude.
I didn't want to be rude. I said, you know, go ahead. I'm gonna let you do it this time. I'll do it next time.
So in other words, you were
yeah.
actually being a gentleman,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. I
Yeah,
tried. I said,
I get
Lola,
it.
no,
I
it's
get
too
it.
dangerous. It's too scary. And she said, no, I want to try. So, yeah.
All right.
But, you know, if she starts to cry or anything, I said, I'll step in and take it, you know. I got you. That's what I
It's
said.
a little late now,
So,
Shannon. What else you got coming? Anything else you want to talk about?
Well, yeah, we're going to talk about a few of the other things that are going on. For example, Frank Ocean is being sued, and it's not by Chris Brown, so we're going to delve into that a little bit. I know that's what everybody's like, the Chris Brown feud, but no, it's not that, so we're going to talk about that. And there's a ton of celebrities, politicians that got hacked recently. So we're going to talk about the whole hacking controversy. Who got
Ooh,
hacked?
the celebrity
what
hacking.
information
Can't
got
wait for
leaked?
that.
Yeah, there's a lot of information that's out there.
All right.
So we're going to talk
I
about
promise
all that.
I won't be too busy. I'll be watching.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I hope everyone at home will be watching as well.
Absolutely. Shannon Lanier, thank you so much.
You got it.
We're almost finished, but we're not finished yet. We want to bring a couple of other people that have been in the show back out on the set with us. We first of all wanted to bring on Brian Palmer, who is a journalist and expert on all things foreign affairs. And then, of course, our business correspondent, Chitra Nabat. Did you have a good experience today?
I did. Thank you for being so gentle.
Oh, were we gentle? We should have called them.
Okay. I should have said that.
That one is new, but it is just our second day.
Yeah.
Gentle. But we appreciate it all the same. We come back, of course?
Of course.
All right, great.
Yeah. What do we have coming up tomorrow on the business front?
Tomorrow we've got entrepreneurship. We are going to be talking about scenario planning, budgeting, and also, too, how some of this budget cuts with sequestration, how that impacts entrepreneurs.
Okay, all right. And then, of course, we also have a robust show that is in the plans. We're going to talk about Detroit.
That's right. Right, the possibility of it potentially being filing for bankruptcy. There are some that are calling for that. As you can imagine, not too many people are going to like that decision should it move forward.
Yeah, I mean, it really is a tale of tragedy. I mean, Detroit was one of the most vibrant cities in this country. Almost every car that was driven around the world was built in Detroit at one time. And now to see it take this decline over all these years and be on the
and because
verge
of the loss of
bankruptcy.
the auto industry there.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
you know, during the most recent presidential election, President Obama made it. That was part of his big campaign platform at the Democratic National Convention. A lot of attention.
They reopened plans.
Right,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
so it's really sad to sort of see how this is unfolding.
Yeah, that'll be interesting to see. And of course, we talked to you about Afghanistan and we talked to you about Iraq and the things that are happening over there a little bit. I surprised you with a story about the Arab Spring. Welcome to live TV, baby.
Yes, indeed.
Since we have just a little bit of time, let's circle back to your field of expertise as it relates to Afghanistan. Of course, President Obama pledged, he ran on the promise that he was going to pull troops out of Afghanistan. Now he has announced that timeline. So many troops will come out this year. They'll all be out with few exceptions by the end of next year. What do you think will happen to the country then?
Well, I think we have to see how many troops are actually going to be pulled out and under what conditions. I think that U.S. government is trying to do what they did in Iraq, which is to ensure that U.S. troops are not going to be accountable under Afghan law, which is a really big sticking point. What's going to happen? I cannot say that, but what I can think and what I think we can suggest is based on what's happened in the past. The U.S. pulls out and instability, even more than what we have now, creeps back in.
Any chance that the Taliban then reasserts their hold?
Well, there's a saying that's been attributed to the head of the Taliban, Mullah Omar, you have the clocks, we have the time.
Mm-hmm.
And the Taliban has proven that they can shrink back and then come back. But there has been, according to some analysts, a rise of a kind of a pragmatic group who within the Taliban, who don't necessarily want to decimate the country again and bring it back to the Stone Age. They want to get into power. And that's one of the things that Hamid Karzai, I think, is having a little trouble with, because the Taliban may be angling for a seat at the table within a government that would challenge Hamid Karzai's power at this point.
And let me ask you before we're out of time, what hot spot should we be looking for? Who's simmering and is about to boil over?
Well, I put a bee in your bonnet about Bangladesh before. We've been talking about Tahrir Square. We really haven't been talking about Shahbag Square, where a pretty serious wave of demonstrations had been happening calling for particular war criminals, people who are war criminals from the 1971 Civil War, which the government has protected, to be brought to justice. Well, when one of these instigators was condemned to death, there was a reaction from fundamentalists from the very, very far right. And there's violence going on, and we should really keep our eyes on that because South Asia is very important.
We'll bring you back to talk more about that when we see it. Shannon Lanier, thanks for sitting in with us. We're going to see you in just a few minutes at Arise Entertainment 360. And of course, we'll be back tomorrow right here on Arise America. We'll be here, so you be here. Have a great day.